Remains, first of all, in terms of dictionary, as a noun, refers to pieces or parts of something that continue to exist when most of it has been used, destroyed, or taken away. And as a verb, it is a part that has not been destroyed, taken, or used up. Something that has yet to be shown. So as an archaeologist, I'm accustomed to be with, think, and work with ruins. Not so much of the 17th century romantic variety with their foliage and green overgrowth, but the glorious ruins, ruins at the center of nationhood, ruins of nationalized crypto colonies. But the training in the poetics and politics of ruins could not make me indifferent to the material presence of contemporary ruination, the ruins of racialized capitalist modernity and hypermodernity, the ruins to be, the future ruins, which are erected all around us day after day. It is the raw materiality of ruins and of ruination, their sensorial immediacy that I'm attentive to. Ruins and ruination, in both their literal and more so in the metaphorical sense, have captured our contemporary collective imagination. From the imperial debris of colonialism to evoke Anstoller, to the capitalist ruins of ecological disaster to recall Anna Tsing, amongst others. Not to mention the earlier evocation of ruins as signifiers of mortality and vulnerability, but also as sites of pleasure that seduce our gaze. I'm proposing today, however, to place this discussion on ruins in the background without forgetting it, in order to think and work with another related concept, that of remains. And this talk is going to have 3 acts, and I'm going to start with the first one called Other Archaeologists. I'll be suggesting that it is the concept of remains that holds enormous potential, both for understanding the contemporary moment and for thinking through and enacting the politics of emancipation and liberation. It is this potential I will be teasing out as I will be conducting an archaeology of the present, sometimes called an archaeology of the contemporary past. Now, this is not a Foucauldian archaeology of knowledge, although elements of it are included in my own definition of archaeology as an expansive field that deals with the relationship between materiality and temporality, rather than merely with ancient things, with just the archaeo in archaeology. In my own definition, archaeology is about the discourses and practices on material things, which are by definition multi-temporal. To continue along similar lines, and for those unfamiliar with it, the archaeology of the contemporary past treats the materiality of the present as if it's already past, as if it's already archaeological. It defamiliarizes something we consider known and familiar, while at the same time, using archaeological sensibility, it helps us understand the textures, the atmospheres, and the material and sensorial intimacy of the present. As I will try to show today, the archaeology of the present unsettles the ontological certainties and the sense of temporality of conventional fields such as history or archaeology, although such potential is yet to be fully explored. I've been studying remains conventionally attributed to different moments in all my life, approaching them from the material, chronopolitical, and sensorial and aesthetic point of view. But in this talk, I'll be reflecting on something rather different. The remains of the largest refugee camp or migrant camp in Europe, the camp of Moria, located on the border island of Lesbos in Greece. I have been visiting, studying, and thinking about this material phenomenon since 2016, one of the many scholars to do so in a project of research cum activism. The exhibition Transient Matter, Assemblages of Migration in the Mediterranean, which is currently on show at the Hafer Museum here at Brown, presents some of that work. So the camp was completely destroyed by fire in September 2020, one of the many losses, to continue on the same theme as Juliette, of the pandemic era, and it's currently being erased as a material presence. Today, I'm proposing to take you on a tour of the burned remains of Moria. In so doing, I'll be reworking parts of a photo essay which was presented recently as part of a portfolio in the website of the American Anthropologist Journal. So, Act 2, The Ashes of Moria. It is the silence that I recall most that day. In early October 2020, when I visited the ruins of Moria. The uncanny and strange silence of a place that I remembered so alive and full of buzz. January 2020 it was when I was here last. The soundscape then was very different. I recall the winter sun. I still hear the sound of an axe falling on olive trees. It was a rare sunny interval in the midst of the winter and people were out chopping firewood. Children were out playing, their voices still in my ears. I recall how stunned I was then to realize the extent of the Moria settlement. Now, instead of chopped firewood and children's voices, mostly silence. Silence that was, however, punctuated by strange noises, dog noises and cat noises. I then remember that the settlement of 2,000 people had attracted many stray cats and dogs, and I recall that they were fed by the inhabitants, shared in some of the food of their human neighbors, which struggled to prepare every day. They also often enjoyed the lion's share from the camp's food prepared by the subcontracted catering company, food that was mostly rejected by humans as they found it inedible. The millions of euros that centralized food provision contract ill-spent the mountains of wasted food, the animals that it attracted from nearby, the illegality and the migration industry and its multi-species entanglements. I know for a fact that of those cats and dogs, some had been adopted by asylum seekers themselves. Strong bonds must have been created, echoing Manus Island in Oceania, and the dogs in the stories narrated by Behruz Buchani. Some of those animals must have left with Moria inhabitants in those terrible nights and days in September, when they gathered what they could and abandoned the burning camp in haste. But most animals remained. They stayed behind. They belonged to the place. They had been here hungry for almost a month now, and they were wandering around. The barking was penetrating and sad and terrible. I hear that some asylum seekers and people from the town come back and feed those animals, but it's not enough. It has been almost a month. We should look at imperial ruins not necessarily as monuments, but as ecologies of remains, says Anne Stoller. Now, to find the thread that connects the remains of old empires that Stoller had in mind with the remains of the present-day border regime, remains sentient or not, that's the first challenge. But there were human noises too. Occasionally, a group of young people, most likely NGO volunteers, would wander like us amongst the ruins and stop and comment at specific locales. Is this a heritage space already? More likely, a landscape of ruination suspended between two temporal states. A landscape going through the time of agony, not a living site, nor a mummified heritage locale either. D, one of my companions, wanted us to see the location of the school and the art studio operated by the Wave of Hope for the Future. This is the media-led initiative started by Afghani people and with whom I collaborated in the staging of the Transient Matter exhibition. I recalled in my last visit to the school, the community library, the art studio, crammed in the area called the jungle, between closely spaced habitation tents and an informal mosque. Later in 2020, I saw in their Facebook post, that they were building a new, larger facility in the area behind the old compound. I was told that this was because the large NGO in charge of the area wanted them out. As we reached the spot, the traces were unmistakable. A large pile of white ash where the library was, many burned acrylic paint tubes and metal cases containing brushes where the art studio once stood, and the large rectangular empty space where the classrooms, the schoolrooms were. As I was walking on, I realized that we were gaining access to areas and spaces that we, white men, locals of sorts, could never possibly have had while the camp was in operation. I had been inside some of those tents a couple of times, cordially invited by their inhabitants, but would mostly sit outside. Now, we could walk into any space. It felt wrong. It felt voyeuristic at times. Now, the area was mostly a vast open-air ruin, an archaeological site with the walls and the roofs and the structures missing, but with a layout, the foundations intact. A perfect site plan to read. The canonical rectangular shape of the wooden pallets laid on the floor for drainage gave the landscape the features of an urban grid. Features that were not known to an outside observer, now they were revealing themselves to us. Interior huts, sunken pits, and closed outdoor toilets, laid interior floors, and sleeping platforms. The objects, the burnt structures, the humble remains were revealing themselves now in their gutted, more intimate, raw state. It is as if the place became more readable, better understood as a ruined locale, as a remnant. An example perhaps of what the anthropologist Yael Navarro calls a negative methodology. They wanted to show me the stone theater, but then something else caught our eye. A series of identical wooden shacks, clearly marked with blue paint and numbered, some complete, some half-built. A paper sign in one of them doors read, "Discard PPE before entering." It was a COVID isolation clinic, the construction of which was interrupted by the fire. Now, Greece as a whole went various lockdowns and reopenings since March 2020, but Moria, along with other migrant camps, was in complete and permanent lockdown and strict quarantine since then. The camp stayed free of COVID until the end of summer of 2020, but then, 6 days before the fire, the first confirmed case was announced. A Somali man who was allowed to travel to the mainland left for Athens, but returned after a month, unable to find work and support there. He was not the only one. Hundreds of them were forced to return. Moria was a hell for its inhabitants, but better the hell they knew, and the one where they could find communal effort, self-organizing, and volunteer support. Soon after, the COVID cases multiplied. According to media reports and my own interlocutors, one possible scenario for the fire was that it started when the authorities wanted to remove infected people out of the camp, but not in a hospital nor in a hotel, but into a warehouse nearby. Inside the old compound, The offices of the Reception and Identification Center abandoned in haste. Metal filing cabinets overturned, loose paper everywhere. Amongst them, handwritten transcripts from interviews. In one such interview taken by the Red Cross, F from Cameroon, and 29-year-old woman asylum seekers interviewed in 2017, a woman who traveled through Guinea and Turkey, who could speak French and Spanish, and who declares Greece as her desired destination. Then a detailed social history written in blue pen, narrating death, imprisonment, sexual violence. A life in fragments scattered amongst the ruins. These interviews would have probably been transferred into digital form, or maybe the case was resolved one way or another, or both. A life deemed of lesser importance, hence Moria. A narrated life on paper, left behind, exposed, not worthy of collection, protection, or curation. I had been in this office once before. It was 2017 during a short conversation with the commander-in-chief of the camp. I recall his notice board, his whiteboard, where he used to write the daily number of inhabitants. This is that whiteboard on the last day, the day of the fire. The bureaucratic logic, desperate to map, to account, to categorize, to maintain the illusion of control. Now, yesterday, Zachary reminded us that we should be attentive not simply to counting, but also to counting us. In this borderland, counting us entails another form of violence, the violence of homogenization, the violence of national labels. Afghani, 77%, Syrian, 88%, DRC, 7%, other 8%. It says 12,768, the total number of people with hyper-optimistic accuracy. Yet after the fire, the tally would not match, with as many as 2,000 people missing. Under departures from fire, from Moria, it is noted with blue, 1 death. And someone who was here after the fire and before us jumped the figures, effaced the officialdom of the board, inflated the numbers, and scribbled Lesbos across the board. Amidst the remnants of the border apparatus, this concrete, classical-looking, fluted Doric column, painted yellow, reminding one that you're in classical lands. The temporality of the classical is entangled here with another temporality. I'm reminded that in this place, before it became a migrant processing facility, was a military barracks and a conscript training center for the Greek army. In the militarized bodily pedagogy of the nation, training and living in the midst of imitated ancient Greek architecture was deemed essential. While in the midst of the Greek Civil War, building such replicas was seen as a good rehabilitation experience and practice for dissidents and internal enemies. In recent years, border crosses in the Aegean were compared by conservative politicians to the ancient Persians, the new invaders that needed to be stopped. In front of the Asylum Service building, which had been blazed more than once in the past in revolts and uprisings, I remember seeing people with papers in hand pushing against the razor-wide entrance. Now, at long last, I had the chance to inspect this fence from up close. It was only then I realized that it was a double fence, creating a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone of sorts in the middle, and that it was only through a small rectangular opening that asylum seekers were able to push the papers through, minimizing any intimate bodily contact. Act 3, haunted matter. The rot remains with us. The men are gone, says Derek Wallock in his 1954 Ruins of a Great House, a poem that still speaks to us in many voices. But not all that remains is wrought. What makes remains such a powerful concept? Beyond their evocation of resilience and resistance, they make the effects of abstract policies, practices, and logics material and tangible. Remains focus sensorial attention. They invite and allow for a close examination. They offer us the possibility to observe, or rather to experience multisensorially, things from up close. In this case, they enable us to understand the materially expressed logics of securitization, segregation, and biopolitical control designed by the camp authorities and the border regime. But also, they invite us to appreciate the craft and the labor that went into migrant world making, into shaping materially a parallel life, into enacting an affirmative biopolitics. This is important and politically efficacious, but there is more to the concept of remains that takes us from politics to ontology and back. I'm thinking of remains as both presence and absence, and evoking Derrida in his Spectres of Marx as material traces that enact an ontological state of haunting, a hauntology, a state that entails, perhaps as its starting point, the affect of mourning. Another connection with Juliet here. And as we were walking amongst the remains of Moria that October day, we were mourning a half-absent and half-present world which we had experienced previously. I was enacting mourning as photography, or photography as mourning, knowing too well that even the remains I was photographing would soon be scattered and drastically transformed. But the ontological state of haunting enacted by remains is also and perhaps primarily about temporality. Haunting is historical but not dated, says again Derrida, while citing time and again Shakespeare, time is out of joint. And while he himself chose not to take this direction further, I would propose, following a Bergsonian ontology this time, that remains suspended between absence and presence, between life and death, enact time as duration. They constitute material memories in the pure sense, memories not as recollections, but as materializations of multitemporality, as past moments and episodes that live on in the fragile consensus we call the present. As such, they are full of haunting potential. Survivance is another term that comes to mind, combining survival and resistance, a term that in most recent years has been associated with writings and struggles of Native American intellectuals. It is also a term that is discussed by Derrida in his last interview, a term denoting, according to him, the most intense life possible. Residence time is another term we may wish to think with here. It was introduced by Christina Sharp to speak of the enslaved Africans who perished in the Middle Passage, but whose remnants are still with us in the wake as atmospheric elements. Residual time would be another term, the durational time of remains as residues, as components of assemblages, no longer in operation, components which can be potentially part of new assemblages. While one could say that all matter embodies and enacts durational time, remains as both presence and absence combine durational temporality with ontology. Let us return to Moria with its haunted remains of migration, the remnants of a border assemblage at the fault line between the global south and the global north. The specters of colonialism, of racial modernity, and its buffer states loom large amidst these remains. Remains suspended in between two such buffer states, Greece and Turkey. I'm reminded again of Christina Sharp's coupling of transatlantic slavery and its haunted presence with a migrant sea crossing from Africa to Europe. And along with it, I'm thinking of Mati Diop's 2019 film, Atlantics, in which the people who embarked on a sea voyage from Senegal to Spain 948 nautical miles away, and who perished in the process, return to haunt the living and to demand justice. The burned remains of Moria speak of the haunted return or haunting return of the colonized. Burned remains. Are the migrants from North Africa to Europe not called haragas, the burned ones in Arabic after all? But remains as hauntology is also about the future. The future is always experienced as haunting, Mark Fisher says. The haunted remains of Moria may conjure up the ghosts of racial and colonial modernity and its bordering practices, as well as the continuous resistance to them. But they also conjure up the specter of different futures. Hauntology as virtuality, as alternative potential histories. The remains of Moria conjure up the specter of a future camp regime with stricter surveillance and containment, where mobilization and organized demonstration would be almost impossible. This regime is already in operation in the replacement camp, named already Moria II. But these very same remnants, the results of a huge fire, after all, which was allowed to burn for 3 days, since it was accepted by authorities and migrants alike that camp was no longer livable, conjure up multiple future possibilities. Their haunting presence reminds us of the fragility of the border apparatus and the potential for its nomadic inhabitants to reshape it. The day after I finished the first draft of this essay in Athens, in Greece, I saw this poster on a wall. The text is part of the lyrics from the song Vertigo FT Spondi by the punk rap metal group Krav Boka, which sings in Greek and in French. Here is how they translate this passage, this kind of themselves. Struggles are my friends' homeland. They throw their future with ashes from Moria. Damascus, Aegean, hotspot Athens, central square of Victoria. We carry stories and thorns in our feet. An itinerary of migration, stories in transit, the sound of hope. Drawing the future with ashes. At Moria, what was burned was much more than the largest migrant camp in Europe. Moria was a ruin foretold. Its burning had been predicted and announced several times over, including in the smaller fires that had actually engulfed the camp in migrant revolts in the past 5 years. But in the remains, we can see clearly, more clearly now than before, the face of Europe, the face of the global North, with its so-called migration crisis. We can trace the contours and feel the texture of the new global apartheid. In the meantime, others will draw in these ashes, on these remains, the shapes of their futures. Thank you very much.